functions are able to receive the argument, but it does not returns any value to the calling function. If I consider this example, the functions are able to receive the values and it's also responsible for returning the value. I'm going to execute same statement again and again and again until the given condition is satisfied. Hello to all, a warm welcome to my new session on user-defined function. I'm Revati, faculty, Department of Computer Science, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Temple of Excellence, Mysuru. Before going to start my today's session, let me to recall the things what I have covered in my last session of this chapter. So in the last session of this chapter, I started with type of arguments. So what is argument here? Here arguments are nothing but the variables, and arguments are classified into 4 different types, that is actual arguments or actual variables, formal arguments or formal variables, global arguments or global variables, as well as local variables. Along with that, I have covered scopes of variables. Along with that, I have covered the types of function. So these are the certain topics I have covered in my last session. But in my today's session, at the beginning, I'm going to deal with the types of function. That means once again, I'm going to deal with the different types of function. So here, user-defined functions are classified into 5 different types. That is, at the beginning, I'm going to have function with no arguments and no return type. That means I'm going to have the function, but it is not going to receive any argument, even it's not going to return any values. Then the second type here is function with argument and no return type. That means functions are able to receive the argument, but it does not returns any value to the calling function. Then the third type here is functions with no arguments and with return type. So as the name itself indicates that it does not receive any arguments, but it's going to return the value. And the fourth type here is functions with arguments and with return type. So here functions are able to receive the argument as well as able to return the value. And the last type here is recursive function. So dear student, in my previous session of this chapter, I have covered functions with no arguments and no return type. That means I'm having the function. So function name is add and it does not receive any arguments and it does not return any value. So the return type is void, function name is add and empty parenthesis. And I'm going to have the block of statements. Now, if I consider second type here, function with arguments. So, this function is going to receive argument. For example, int a, comma, int b, and it does not return any values. For that reason, it is void and block of statement. So these are the 2 types I have covered in my previous session of this chapter. But in my today's class, I'm going to deal with functions with arguments as well as return type, and the last topic here is recursive function. Now moving on to the third type, that is functions with no arguments and with a return type. So as the name itself indicates that function with no arguments, that means it won't receive any values or any arguments, but it's going to return the value. For example, say int. I'm going to specify the data type because it's going to return the value. But here it is empty parenthesis because it does not receive any variable or any value. So this method, the function receives no arguments. In this type of method, the function does not receive any value or any argument, but it's going to return the value. And the general syntax here is, at the beginning I'm going to have the return type and I'm going to specify the function name, and opening and closing parenthesis indicates that empty. That means it does not receive any argument, and I'm going to have set of values or set of statements. Along with that, I'm going to have the return keyword to return the value to the calling function. So this is my called function, and this is going to return the value to the calling function. Now I'm going to have the simple example here that I want to find the greatest of two numbers. So my return type here is integer and my function name here is greatest. And here I'm having two value or two variables A and B. Now I'm going to check if A is greater than B, then I'm going to return A. Else I'm going to return B. So here I'm going to declare the variable int A equal to 20 and int B equal to 30. And I'm going to return the value A and B to where? To my calling function. So in my main program, I'm going to call this function, that is greatest. So dear student, in my main program, I'm going to call this greatest function, and when I call this greatest function, the control transferred to called function. So the control is directly transferred to called function greatest, and it's going to perform all its operation and sends the result back to the calling function. Moving further, I'm going to have the fourth type of function, that is function with argument and with return type. So as the name indicates that the function is capable to accept variables as well as it's going to return the value. So let me to take one simple example, that is int add, and I'm going to have the arguments. So this is the example for function with arguments and with return type. So here I'm having arguments as well as I'm having return type. Now in this method, the function receives some arguments and returns a value. If I consider this example, the functions are able to receive the values and it's also responsible for returning the value. Now this is the general syntax I'm going to have here, that is at the beginning I'm going to have the return type specifier, that is nothing but any data type I can able to specify. Along with that, I'm going to have the user defined function name, and I'm having list, that is list of arguments. Along with that, I'm going to have block of statement. After the execution of block of statement, I want to return the value because I'm having return type here. For that reason, I want to return the value to the calling function. Now, let me to take simple example here. Think that I want to find the interest. And what are the variables I'm having here? I'm having P, T and rate. That is principal amount, time and rate of interest. And all the variables are of type float. For that reason, the returning value also float. Now, this interest is nothing but the user defined function. Now find the simple interest. After finding simple interest, return the interest to the calling function, where I'm going to call this function in my main program. And when I call this function in my main program, the control directly transferred to calling function. So in my main program, I'm going to call interest and I'm going to pass the value. This is the way call this function. Along with that, I'm going to pass the values, and when I pass this value, the control transfer to called function, and the P holds the value 5, T holds the value 10 and R holds the value 20. Now perform all the operation, that is find the simple interest back to the main program. That's nothing but the calling program or calling function. So when I call this function, the control transfer to called function, perform all the operation and send the result back to the calling function. So this is the way I can able to use function with argument and with return type. Moving further, I'm going to have function with arguments and with no return type. According to this type, function can have the argument, but it does not return any value. So this method of function receives some arguments. That means this function can able to receive the arguments, but it does not return any value. So no return value. For example, I'll write void, then add function. So this is my function name, and int is nothing but the arguments. So this is the return type that indicates that I'm not going to return any value. So it is empty set. For that reason it is void. And this is my user defined function name, and these are my argument list. Now let me to consider this syntax here. At the beginning, I'm going to have the return type, then I'm going to have the function name, and I'm going to have the argument list, and I'm going to have set of statement. But I'm not going to include return statement because this function does not return any value. For that reason, I'm not going to include return type in this type of function. Now let me to take the simple example here. So what's the return type? It is void. That means it is not returning any values. And what is my function name? That is interest, and I'm having three variables, say P, T and R. Now I'm going to find the simple interest. After finding simple interest, here itself I'm going to display the simple interest. So here I'm not going to return any value. So dear student, just make a note here that I'm not going to return any value. Here itself I'm going to print the value. So how this function is going to work here? At the beginning, I'm going to call this function in my main program. Then I'm going to pass the value. Okay, when I call this function in my main program, the control transferred to calling function. What is my function name? It is interest. Now P holds 5, T holds 10 and R holds 20. Now perform operation, that is find the simple interest and display the result itself. This is the way this function is going to work. Now moving on to the fourth type of function, that is function with no argument and no return type. That means this kind of functions are not able to receive the argument and not able to return the value. So example, first I'm going to write the void keyword, then function name and opening and closing parenthesis. This indicates that it does not return any value and it does not receive any value or any arguments. In this method, the function receives with no arguments but no return value. That means this kind of functions are not able to receive any argument or values and it does not return any value. So here I'm going to have the general form, that is first it is return type. Then I'm having function name, there is nothing but the user defined function name, and I'm having opening and closing parenthesis, and I'm having set of statement. So dear student, make a note here that I'm not going to return any values. For that reason, I'm not having return statement in this type of function. Now let me to consider the simple example here that I need to find the greatest of two numbers. So my function name here is greatest and my return type here is void, because it does not return any values to the program or any values to the function. Now here I'm going to check if A is greater than B, then I'm going to print A, else I'm going to print B. Now let me to explain the last type of function here is recursive. So it is nothing but the recursion. So what is recursion? So here recursions are nothing but the repetition. So I'm going to execute same statement again and again and again until the given condition is satisfied. That means I'm going to call same function name again and again and again until the given condition is satisfied. So here recursive function is a function that calls itself. Let me to consider the example that I need to find the factorial of a given number. So I'm going to call this function again and again. That means this function is going to call by itself until the given condition is true. That means it's going to call itself until the specified condition is true. And once the condition gets failed, it comes out from that function. So the process of calling function by itself. Here the same function is called again and again. That is called the process of calling function by itself is called as recursion. Now let me to consider the syntax here. At the beginning I'm going to have the return type and I'm going to have the function name and I'm going to have the argument list. And I'm going to have this statement, and I'm going to have the return value. Along with that, I'm going to specify the function name, and I'm going to specify the argument list. So dear student, let me to consider simple example here. That is, in the place of return type, I'm going to write the return type int. I'm going to write the function name factorial, and I'm going to have the argument, that is int n. Now what I will do, I'm going to consider number, that is nothing but n, into fact n minus 1. That means I'm going to call same function again and again. So the function that calls again or itself until the given condition is true. Okay, so it's going to find the factorial of a given number, and it's going to return that factorial to the calling function. So this is the way the recursive function is going to work. So recursive function is a function that calls itself. The same function is called by self. That means it's going to call by itself, and this process of calling the function by itself is called recursion. Now let me to consider the simple example here. This is the simple program used to find the exponent of a given number. So here my function name here is expo, and it's going to take two argument, float and integer, and it's going to return some value. For that reason it is floating point. So this is nothing but my function prototype. Now I'm going to take another variable called y. Now I want to read the base, so I'm going to read the base value. Now I'm going to enter the exponent, and I want to set the precision, that is 3. Now here I'm going to call the exponent, and I'm going to pass x value as well as y value. For example, say 2 and 3. Now here I'm going to check. So here a holds base, this is my base, and this is my exponent. Now if base is equal to 0, I want to return the value 0. And if my exponent value is equal to 0, then I'm going to return 1. Else, if my exponent is greater than 0, then I want to find the exponent of a given number. Okay, so this is nothing but my recursive function. That means this function is going to call again and again. So until this n minus 1 becomes false. Else, if n is greater than 0, this condition. Else, if this condition is false, then 1 by a, then I'm going to find the exponent, that is here n plus 1. This is the way I can able to use recursive function in my program. So dear student, this is the simple program used to find the exponent of a given number. Not only exponent of a given number, we can able to find the factorial or Fibonacci or GCD of two numbers, etc. So what is recursive? The same function is going to call by itself, and that kind of functions are called recursion or recursive function. So dear student, in my today's session, You got more information about functions. Let's meet in the next session with some more information about functions. Until then, keep watching and keep learning. Thank you.